Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, everyone's favourite marmalade-loving bear is back for another misadventure in Paddington 2. Paddington, voiced by Ben Whishaw, wants the perfect present for his Aunt Lucy, voiced by Imelda Staunton, for her 100th birthday, a vintage pop-up book of London in the antique shop of Mr. Gruber, played by Jim Broadbent. When washed-up actor Phoenix Buchanan, played by Hugh Grant, steals the book to find a hidden treasure, Paddington pursues him but ends up framed for the crime. As Paddington is sent to prison where he has to deal with Knuckles McGinty, played by Brendan Gleeson, the Brown family, Hugh Bonneville's Henry, Sally Hawkins' Mary, Madeline Harris's Judy, Samuel Jocelyn's Jonathan, and Julie Walters' Mrs. Bird must track down the real culprit and prove the bear's innocence. When Michael Bond created Paddington Bear in 1958, he didn't just invent a beloved character, he created a cultural icon. When you think of Paddington Bear, I think of something as synonymous with London and Britishness as much as Big Ben or a big bright red double-decker bus. It's that kind of affection that we have for the character. In fact, he's the face of one of the big Christmas campaigns this year. He's currently fronting the Marks & Spencer's Christmas ad, reprised once more by Ben Whishaw, who plays Paddington in the films, and it's a lovely ad all by itself. Sadly, Bond passed away earlier this year while Paddington 2 was wrapping up filming, and the final film is dedicated to him. His final Paddington Bear book will be published next year. Now, when it comes to the films, I have to admit that when the first Paddington was announced and they released the early trailers, I was very sceptical about it, because it's the kind of character that could very easily be mangled in an adaptation, and you only have to look at what's currently happening to Peter Rabbit to see an example of that. But when I saw the movie, I was totally won over by it. It is genuinely wonderful and really has its heart in the right place. If you haven't seen the original Paddington, it's probably one of the best family films to come out in the past decade. So I came into Paddington 2 with fairly high expectations, especially because so much of the talent from the original film has come back for this follow-up, including director Paul King, who also co-wrote the script, along with Simon Farnaby, who's also back and also reprises his small supporting role as an amorous security guard. But most of the main cast of the first film are also back in this entry, with the exception of Nicole Kidman. But the question is, whether they'd be able to recapture the charm of the first one, and I'm elated to report that yes, they do. Early on in Paddington 2, there's this sequence where Paddington opens up the pop-up book of London that he's going to give to Aunt Lucy, and in this fairly long fantasy sequence, he imagines himself inside its pages as he runs down to greet Lucy as she arrives on a paper boat, and then, through the pages of the book, takes her on a tour of London. It's a really emotional, really terrific, visually stunning sequence very early on, and I think it's this sequence that really encapsulates the appeal and charm of the Paddington movies, because of course the version of London that's depicted in them isn't meant to be reality. It's always meant to be this idealised version of it, sort of like how a tourist would imagine it, or a traveller. And so that, I think, is hugely resonant through these movies, and there is this recurring idea throughout Paddington 2 of worlds within worlds, these fantasies. For example, later on, Paddington imagines in his cell the jungles of Peru suddenly sprouting out of the ground, and later on there's another moment where the camera actually swoops inside a model of the prison as a scene transition. But what makes it so touching is that, yes, the London depicted in the films isn't reality, but it's what we like to imagine it to be. But it has other resonance as well, because of course Paddington is an immigrant story. He's a bear from darkest Peru, and he's in search of adventure and family. And what's always been this subtle running gag through both these movies is the fact that, yes, there's a bear wandering around, but no one seems to pay it much mind or notice, and that's always been a subtly amusing but also quite touching thing at the same time. It imagines London as this open, accommodating place that's really welcoming, and when we pick up Paddington at the start of this sequel, he's not only accepted, but fully integrated. He is friends with virtually everyone on the streets of Windsor Gardens, and his presence immeasurably improves their lives. We see that in the opening sequence of the film, and what a change there is afterwards once he's thrown into prison. This street is lined up with a number of comedy regulars, if you're from the UK, the likes of Sanjeev Bhaskar, Ben Miller, and Jessica Haynes. The latter two actually have a surprisingly nice little subplot romance going on through the movie, which is a very nice touch. It makes the world feel a lot more habited inside this version of London. The idea is basically Paddington views the world with such warmth and generosity of spirit, and that is repaid in kind by his neighbours, literally. And that is a really heartwarming idea, and I really love that about these movies, and it's all about accepting Paddington's worldview, which is totally without cynicism, totally without a nasty bone in his body. The only person that refuses to accept Paddington is, of course, Mr. Curry, played once again by Peter Capaldi, who in this sequel seems very much imagined as that sort of person that looks for the absolute worst in people, that he's clearly meant to be an analog for a certain type of individual, and in this movie he's very much imagined as this busybody who has taken on this neighbourhood watch job all by himself, but really no one pays him that much notice, no one really takes him seriously because he's such a self-centered character. And even though there is this figure in there, the film doesn't really pay him that much mind in this instance, and you're not really supposed to. It's critical of Mr. Curry, but really the film sides with everyone else in that community that's very much in Paddington's favour, and they rally round to his cause, and I think that is a really lovely message to behold. And that cheerful worldview is challenged by the premise of the movie, because clearly the filmmakers have thought to themselves, okay, where can we put Paddington Bear where it would be most out of place and most challenged by the scenario? And the answer is in prison, in the Nick. And so that plays out on screen, this culture clash comedy, and Paddington goes into this place that is both openly hostile and potentially quite threatening, and yes, he's somewhat naive, but he approaches it with the same politeness and nicety that he would with any other interaction, and in doing so, prison doesn't change Paddington, it doesn't harden him, he instead changes prison to suit him. It's wonderful to see this transformation play out on screen. There's a lot of fish out of water comedy to be had in that transformation. I think the filmmakers have clearly taken a lot of inspiration from the Grand Budapest Hotel, particularly the sequences where Gustav ends up in prison. I think they use that very much as the basis for these sequences, especially because there's a moment where Paddington accidentally turns their uniforms pink. I honestly think that must be a homage, and it's really effective, and it just goes to show sometimes a really unorthodox plot choice, I mean I certainly wouldn't have chosen this as the basis for a Paddington sequel, can pay off dividends. It works beautifully on screen. And Paddington himself remains a brilliant character. They write him so well in these movies, and Ben Whishaw is exceptionally well cast as his voice. He has this formality, but also this vulnerability to his voice and this youthfulness. I think it really comes across on screen, and he's even better in this movie because they had Whishaw on board from the very beginning. If you remember on the previous film, he was a late replacement for Colin Firth, and I think they play towards his strengths even more in this outing. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the CGI animators. I think they've done a superb job of Paddington in this film. He is a great CGI creation, and he's superbly integrated all the way through the film. It seems totally natural. You'd almost believe they filmed with a bear on set. You can't see the joins between him and the actors, even though he's obviously been added in later. It's that good. And it's especially so when you realise how physical Paddington is in this movie and how much he has to interact with his environment, because Paddington is notoriously accident prone, and so we get a lot of elaborately staged slapstick sequences where he finds himself in a lot of trouble, especially in an early sequence where he takes a job in a barber shop. That sequence by itself is genuinely superb, and I think the attitude that they've treated the character with comes a lot from silent cinema. They very, very explicitly reference the debt to the likes of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, with a little homage later on in the movie where Paddington actually gets a bit Chaplin-esque. They do a bit of a modern times reference, which I appreciated the little shout out there. If there is fault to be found in this movie, then it's with the recurring human characters who aren't given enough to do in this outing, in particular the Brown family. Of them, the one that gets by far the most screen time is Sally Hawkins Mary, the eccentric, adventurous illustrator who immediately takes up Paddington's cause and sets about trying to find his innocence and locate the real perpetrator. And she very much carries this plot line, and Hawkins is a real delight. She is the character that probably shares the closest sensibility to Paddington himself, which is why they've chosen her to lead this plotline, and it gives her a lot more to do than she did in the first movie. But she's really the exception, because as far as the rest of the family goes, I'm not sure the film knows quite what to do with them. In particular, Hugh Bonneville, who kind of went through his arc all the way through the first movie. He was very strict and rule-based, and he sort of regressed back into his looser, hippie sensibility. In this film, he's given this midlife crisis subplot, but really the character's reverted back to how he was in the first movie to a certain extent. It feels like he's kind of gone back, and they just didn't know quite what to do with Bonneville in this movie. He's ostensibly the top billed lead, but really he comes out of this movie in and out of it. He's not given a whole bunch to do. The film tries to do what the first Paddington did, where the family's hobbies and obsessions, they all come into play towards the end of the movie, but because we've spent less time focused on those elements, they pay off maybe less so in this entry, it has to be said. They try to recapture that. It doesn't quite work. But making up for that, the new cast are absolutely brilliant. First of all, we have Brendan Gleeson as Knuckles McGinty, a fellow prisoner and the prison chef that Paddington manages to integrate himself with. And Gleeson is a phenomenal character actor. He's great even when the films aren't, and in this, he plays the role to perfection. It's another one of those characters that Gleeson has a really great grasp of, those very tough on the outside, but quite soft and compassionate on the interiors. And so he's playing this comically intimidating hard man that Paddington manages to work his magic on, and in doing so finds a passion and enthusiasm for what he's doing. And so many of the film's best comedic interplays are those scenes with Gleeson playing against Paddington, which are even more so when you realise that Gleeson's actually playing against nothing, because Paddington's a CGI creation, and yet those scenes together work so well. And Gleeson takes home many of the film's big laughs, and Gleeson would run away with this film if it weren't for Hugh Grant. He is merciless in this film. He doesn't just steal the pop-up book, he steals the whole movie. Every single scene he's in is electric. Grant plays Phoenix Buchanan, who is this has-been, washed-up actor who is this total egocentric. He's completely destroyed his career because he cannot stand acting alongside anyone else, and he's trying to finance a comeback from dog food commercials. If you've ever had a hankering to see Hugh Grant in a dog outfit, this is the movie for you. And you can clearly tell that Grant is having a whale of a time. He clearly has based this on certain pompous, lovey actors that he knows, and he just goes for it. He has such hilarious moments all throughout that I couldn't list them all here, and quite frankly, I wouldn't want to spoil them, but the scenes that had me in the most hysterics, the scenes set in his attic where he has the theatrical costumes that he uses as disguises all set up around. And so he has these various characters like Scrooge and Poirot and so on and so forth, and he's having these villainous conversations to himself, but he's also going in and out of these other characters talking to himself. Those scenes had me almost doubled over in laughter. As you can probably tell, I adored Paddington 2. I think it's the rare sequel that lives up to the original, and both kids and adults will love this movie because it's so consistently funny. But at the centre of it, it has this huge, open, gaping, compassionate heart that really makes you warm to it. And I think that positivity of spirit of the film just radiates throughout. It rubs off on the audience. You come out of this movie and you feel lifted and have a huge smile on your face. It's the kind of movie that we need at this moment in time, I think. I highly recommend it. It's great family entertainment. And on one final note, there are plenty of movies that critics have said dismissively, oh, the credits are really the best part. Well, with Paddington 2, the credits are indeed the best part, and I mean that sincerely. Do stick around. Paddington 2 is another delightful marmalade sandwich that lives up to the high standards set by its predecessor, continuing to be warmly inclusive and sharing the same optimistic spirit of the bear himself. The film portrays London like a storybook fantasy that's full of adventure and wonder and timelessly quintessentially British. Once more, Paddington is a winning creation thanks to the combination of Wishaw's innocent voice work and excellent CGI that gives his slapstick clumsiness the appeal of silent cinema comics. The returning cast pick up where they left off, but the show is stolen by the new additions, particularly Brendan Gleeson and Hugh Grant's vain and flamboyant actor. Like the first, it's a total pleasure that leaves you with your heart warmed and your spirits raised. It's pure cinematic joy. If you like this review, then get your paws over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.